Hello, I'm Emily Selove, and I am a lecturer at the University of Exeter, senior lecturer, thank you very much. And I'm here with my former, thanks, my former undergraduate thesis advisor, Professor Shawkat Toorawa, now at Yale University. We were at Cornell when we first met. And he's kindly agreed to just have a little conversation with me about my new book, Popeye and Curly, 120 Days in Medieval Baghdad. So welcome to you. Perfect. Can I still call you Professor Toorawa? I'll try to call you Shawkat since.
No, you should call me Shawkat.
Yeah, okay, Shawkat.
There's much water under that bridge that Banasha endowed in Baghdad.
Yeah. So, okay, just very quickly to tell everybody, in case you don't know what this book is, it is a book of cartoons, 120 scenes from Abbasid Baghdad. Abbasid Empire reigned from around 750 to 1258 of the Common Era. And Popeye and Curly are translations of the names of Alhaj and Abu Nuwas, who are, in my opinion, the most important prose writer and poet of the city, hugely influential. And because they were so important and influential, their characters, Popeye and Curly, tend to stand in for a wide range of similar prose writers and poets and characters like them. And Popeye is pretty literal translation of the name Alhaj, because he had an ocular deformity that caused his eyes to protrude. So his name meant the guy with the bulgy eyes. And Abu Nuwas's name means something like a guy with a dangly or curly lock of hair. So that's where the title of the book comes from. Maybe we should just dive in. Is that enough of an introduction to get the conversation started?
Yeah, I would think you'd have two other characters maybe you might want to mention.
Yeah, so there.
With them, yeah.
Yeah, there are many recurring
Grouchy.
characters.
Grouchy.
There's the Grouch as well, yeah. So there are many recurring characters. Their two best friends, Popeye and Curly, are Coral, which she's a singing girl. And that's a translation of the name Marjan, which is a name that I've seen given to a singing girl in medieval Arabic text. And the Caliph, who ends up being all of the caliphs from 750 to 1258. So each of those four characters basically ends up standing for a wide range of types over several hundred years in the city of Abbasid Baghdad. So sometimes also even Kufa and Basra. So yeah, they get it. But weirdly, they take on their own personalities as well. So I think they become characters in their own right.
Well, I think, in fact, that's one of the strengths of the way you've done this, is to make them stand in for a sort of a range of other poets, prose writers, caliphs, whatever, as applicable, but also, as a way to just illustrate the diversity. I can imagine that if you'd populated it with all the actual characters from different periods and times, people would just lose track and not be able to really kind of home in on what you were trying to do, which is to paint a broad brushstroke picture of Abbasid civilization, to the extent that one can do that. This is a pretty good way to do it. But tell us a little bit, your listeners, I know answers to some of these questions, but not all of them, about why you embarked on something like this.
Well, I guess I kind of embarked on it with my students in mind. I'm always trying to convey the humor and fun that I derive from medieval Arabic literature to my students. And it's a form of translation, really. The cartoon is a format that people immediately associate with a joke. They know a joke's coming up, so that helps set the tone. And yeah, it just helps me convey the fun of it and to invite as many people into the wonderful world of medieval Arabic literature as I can entice there. And it's also a way of highlighting the bits of it that make me laugh and that give me pleasure, and support my little pet theories that it's more.
But so you've actually illustrated before. You illustrated your undergraduate thesis,
yes.
Which then turned into a wonderful book on the art of party crashing. Although I should say that I did not know until I read this one that you'd, I guess, revised your view of what Khatib al-Baghdadi was doing in that work. But in any case, So but it's always been illustrations, right? Drawings. They made it onto the cover of that book. Even the cover of your monograph is a drawing. This is the first time you've undertaken a strip.
That's true. Yeah, the drawings took over. So the idea for it did start when I was an undergraduate at Cornell, and this publication is the result of my undergraduate thesis, which I actually have it here. I notice it even has your little red correction.
Oh, it's hard to see because the light. Oh my goodness, yes.
You said I'd be doing certain mock to see into my bibliography.
Citing my own teachers is always a good thing.
Yeah.
He would have loved this. You know, he was in one sense, he was very orthodox, both actually religiously and also about scholarship, but not in the sense that he thought that it should be limiting in any way. Orthodox more in the sense that one should do it properly, as it were. And this has been, reading this, you know, Michael Cooperson says on the cover of the endorsement of this book, you can get a PhD in classical Arabic literature, or you can just buy this book, which is both tongue in cheek, but also, you know, illustrative of how much there is to learn, how much one can actually pack into something like this. You should probably mention for the viewers the role the pandemic played.
Yeah, so I was stuck at home in a way that gave me the kind of cooped up energy and time to carry this project through. It's one of those ideas that occurs to you and you think, oh yeah, that's a good idea, and then you get distracted, but I had nothing to distract me, so I did it. And I did kind of do one a day. I felt weirdly driven to produce one a day and just ransacked my physical and virtual library looking for anecdotes to turn into strips. And you know, the result, I think, was a little bit like the way that medieval Arabic literature is organized in anecdotes. Little short anecdotes or poems or jokes is how, you know, the average medieval
And
Arabic.
you did this online on Facebook, which is where I first noticed this.
Yeah, and it was on Facebook, and from the very beginning, it was kind of the likes from my Facebook friends that kept me motivated. So
all of whom you acknowledge, in fact, in the book. But one big difference, of course, is that, well, besides the fact that it's been gathered together, although there's a rich tradition of things appearing in strips and then being brought together. Calvin and Hobbes comes to mind. But the big difference is that, well, two really. One is that you use the 3-frame, not a 4-frame, which is unusual in the world of comic strips. And the other is that it was subsequently, is the right term, colorized?
Yeah. A professional artist named Jonathan Rudder did the coloring in very beautifully for me, and based those colors on the medieval illustrated manuscripts that I was kind of inspired by myself in the look of the original drawings.
In fact, would you be able to call up by any chance the appendix?
Yeah.
I think it's page 156, 157.
Yeah. Are you seeing?
I am seeing it.
Okay. So here, yeah. Let me just rotate the view for you.
Yeah, rotating it would be good. Excellent. Yes. So, so clearly.
So yeah, this is the Caliph. It's actually, this original figure was the governor of Damascus, I think, or something like that, in the Maqamat. So these are stories about tricksters, very famous stories about tricksters that were illustrated by a man named Al-Wasiti in a really famous manuscript that you see reproduced in books about medieval Arabic literature a lot. And so this guy, who I think is actually just a governor of a city, became the kind of stand-in image for the Caliph. So
well, in a way, you did the same thing. You used some of the visual material and adapted it to your purposes without attempting to actually reproduce. So you didn't illustrate the maqamat. And the one question, of course, that goes begging here is, do you have any intention of doing something like illustrating the maqamat or writing? So rather than using Jahiz and Abu Nuwas or Popeye and Curly as stand-ins, is there any interest now that this has been evidently so successful? It was successful even as a strip on Facebook, but yeah. I can only imagine how successful it will be as a book in the hands of readers. Have you considered taking a work like, I don't know, like the Art of Party Crashing or closer to my own heart, Consorts of the Caliphs by Ibn Asai, which is, these short biographies, or I don't know, passages from the Kitab al-Aghani or from Tabari, I don't know, anything, and actually producing a graphic novel, right? What is called sequential art, right? Where you would not just do a strip, and it wouldn't just be sort of broadly representative, but would actually be the story told in visual form. Is that something that appeals, or?
Well, more than 3 squares might make sense. Like I was saying, for the most part, the medieval Arabic texts that I was basing this off are themselves collections of very short anecdotes and jokes. So, I mean, the fact that it has 3 squares was really a matter of, I had a piece of cardboard on my desk when I thought of the idea that was that shape. So there wasn't a lot of thought that went into that, but I have got a couple little emails from people who enjoyed this book and have thought of other books that they love from medieval Arabic literature that have funny jokes in them, and asking, can I make a strip based on that? And I'm happy to give it a go. The hardest part,
the cardboard constraint is actually the history not only of the production of books, right, which is the constraint of the size of the page and the layout, but it's true of the art as well. Depending on who's working and where they were working. And so there's a reason that it's short when it's being serialized in a newspaper or on Facebook. And of course, there's a reason that it is really, the sky's the limit when it's being conceived of as a graphic novel or as something larger than that. You can look at a page of Tintin and reduce it down to its 9 frames or its 3 frames or whatever. Well, I personally would be very excited to see something. Michael Cooperson and I, many years ago, in fact, I want to say 30 years ago, had this idea. And when I say had this idea, I mean, I just threw out ideas and he was going to do all the work because he illustrates.
He does. My PhD supervisor, I should mention.
Right. Yes, exactly. We had this idea of having a medieval Baghdad, but we were going to be in the 9th century, and we had these characters, and we came up with names. And the only names I remember is the legal scholar's name was going to be Usul al-Fiqh. So all the names end with X. And, the literary criticism guy was going to be called Rhetorics. And there was a guy from Yemen called Arabia Felix.
Oh, good idea.
There was going to be actually, we hadn't decided whether the Sufi or whether the guy who studied the Sufi was going to be called Lexic Techniques, because that's the name of Massignon's study, Lexic Technique de la Mystique.
I see.
And other such things. And, I mean, these ideas occur and, they come in, they float in and out, and there isn't time. But there's something to be said in so many other areas of the study of whether it's ancient Greece or Rome or Civil War, Europe. There are these major works of graphic and sequential art. Your only predecessor that I'm aware of that's kind of big is material related to the Arabian Nights.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Which there is a considerable amount, and I actually recently wrote a short piece. Paulo Horta is editing a volume called Approaches to Teaching the Arabian Nights, and I wrote the piece on teaching the Nights with graphic material.
Interesting. Yeah, I imagine there's been a comic strip or a graphic novel version of that made. I didn't even think
I mean, so not so much a faithful version, but in the sense that no one has sat down that I'm aware of to just illustrate the Nights in a graphic novel, but things have been used, things have been reworked, and there's wild things. When I was in Oxford in 2007, I think it was then, Christopher Melchett gave me a copy of an Uncle Scrooge comic related to the Arabian Nights. So I mean, weird stuff happens in the world.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to ask you one really hard question before we get into the actual material, which is, did you in any way feel constrained or concerned about the representation? So not only are you representing medieval Arabic, medieval Islamic culture, but you're also having to, that is to say, represent what it represented, but also visually represent men, women, material culture, scenes. Was it simple to just turn to Wasiti and let that be the kind of visual universe, or?
Yeah, I really did just kind of lean on Wasiti for the look of it all. I mean, so Jahiz is famously, his grandfather was Abyssinian, And a lot of scholars think that he himself had very dark skin. So when Jonathan Rutter colored it in for me, I asked him to have dark skin, but actually most of the people in Wasity's manuscript have very pale skin. I'm not sure what artistic tradition he was influenced by in that. But yeah, so if when I drew a table or a bookshelf or an item of architecture, I would try to find some kind of precedent in his.
A latrine, actually, I think you mentioned on one of the
There's
points.
a toilet that came from Medina de Zahra in Cordoba.
Cordoba.
Yeah, as a picture.
Which of course is a great place to go, because there's this account, I can't remember who it is now, who is visiting Cordoba. He's a Baghdadi visiting Cordoba. And one of the things he says is, it was like I was at home, because everything I saw reminded me of Baghdad. And so we really do have a kind of visual repository of at least some of the stuff in Baghdad. Yeah.
Sorry, but I mean, just about like conveying Islamic culture or the culture of medieval Baghdad, I think more specifically, I think it is a matter of balancing out what has been given the most attention so far. So, for various reasons, people are motivated for different reasons to focus on the so-called serious material, the religious text or the historical text. But the philosophy of medieval Baghdadi literature itself was to have balance of humor and jest. It was a central tenet of just like mental and spiritual health and good literature. So I see myself as the counterbalance to all the serious scholarship that's going before me.
Well, I would dispute that your scholarship isn't serious, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, I want to show you. This is maybe my personal nerdy favorite joke for that reason. So this is Popeye.
And that was actually on my original. It was my original list of things to maybe show, because simply because of the way. Yeah, absolutely. This is very illustrative. Actually, if we this is a good page to show folks who haven't seen the book yet, because it demonstrates how most, though not all, of the pages are set up, which is the 3 frame, and then the fact that you share. Sometimes the Arabic, for whatever reason, in this case, it's actually a proof text. Sometimes you have quite a lot of commentary in which you try to explain something. The value of the whole collection as a pedagogical tool is beyond question. I mean, you could not be accused of or having just produced a book of comics. It really is full of very important and interesting information, and you do maintain that balance. And here it is. I mean, books that include both serious and silly, you have that throughout, which is great.
Yeah, it is. Professor Jan van Helder, who wrote the preface for it, said that I was writing in the tradition of seriousness and jest as the educational literature. So I'm going to pretend that was my intention all along. But I think I have an unusually well footnoted or referenced book of cartoons here at the very least. So.
No, I think it's funny that you say that, because I mean, when you started out, evidently you started out making one, and then you did another, mm-hmm. And yet the proof, as it were, that it's rooted in a kind of way that you imagine medieval Baghdad is the fact that the book was, I assume, relatively easily divisible into the 9 chapters. And I'm just going to, for the benefit of those watching, read off the headings. Daily life in Baghdad, the Caliph, Islam and other religions, Baghdad ladies, knowledge, learning and language, philosophy and medicine, parentheses and magic, literature and poetry, party conversation, Baghdad and Europe. I mean, those, these are the things that are of interest. And so, one can look at it and say, I think one could look at it and say, oh, Emily's really just interested in the balance of the silly and the serious, or she's interested in redressing, as you yourself characterize it, redressing the undue attention paid to the, what do you want to call it? Let's call it the political and the religious. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that all of this is illustrative of all the aspects of life. And this is why you were able to turn to books like Ahsan's Social Life Under the Abbasids, or the articles in the earlier book that you do. Do you have it at hand, the Baghdad book? also produced by Theron Press?
Yeah, so those chapter divisions were based on the chapter divisions of this textbook that I edited.
Right, so this is my point. My point is that in your scholarship, you're already thinking about things in these categories, and it was easy to then organize this that way because you're always thinking about those things, right? It's not as if you just sat down and said, I'm going to just produce all the scurrilous material that there is, although I imagine that was probably your initial instinct.
No, just the funny things. They're not all dirty jokes.
They mostly are. And you've done a great service to teachers and parents because in the appendix, so the first appendix, which we saw a shot of, is of the visual inspiration. The second appendix is called Fun for Young Readers, and it allows the teacher or the parent or the prude, I guess, to find the ones that are age appropriate for the especially young, and still introduce them to this world, which is of course great. But can we
to my credit, I'm no more.
Go ahead.
Can I just defend myself briefly by saying that I'm no more scurrilous than medieval literature itself, which is not saying much, but the taste of medieval readers ran to the
actually, the stakes are pretty high. You know, when the Library of Arabic Literature decided to do Consorts of the Caliphs, right, which is this collection of microbiographies of women married by the caliphs throughout the Abbasid period who weren't born free. Although in the end, the book includes some princesses, so there are some freeborn women. Before we even embarked on putting it together, we had a public event in Abu Dhabi where all the editors were on the panel, you know, on the kind of podium, not the podium, on the stage, and we were addressing an audience of maybe 50 people, maybe 30 of whom were Arab. Not all were from the UAE, but all Arab, and they took great exception to the fact that we had selected as one of the kind of books that we were going to include this book about what many of them thought was trivial, or if not trivial, was going to provide the Anglophone world and the Anglophone readership with an entry into that history that was organized around unfree, enslaved women being married, and in the case of some of the anecdotes, abused by men. And we had a dickens of a time defending it, and eventually fell back on the true but nevertheless weak argument in the eyes and ears of the audience of, well, this is the tradition, and it's not that we are, we're not being voyeuristic or unfairly focusing on things that don't matter, but it is a view that is held by people out there, and one encounters this all the time, right? So that if someone is working on something that is purportedly marginal, right, there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction. Why would you be interested in magic? Why would you be interested in the scurrilous? Why would you be interested in slavery and so on?
Okay, I'm sorry, I can't let you go on anymore because you said too many things that I have opinions about.
Good, I know, that's why I want to hear them.
First of all, those last categories are very much our modern taste being imposed inappropriately on medieval readers. And second of all, as a female reader, sometimes I get a little tired of just reading male author after male author, and the Jawari, or slave women, their literary voices survived and are so bright and witty and deeply erudite, and which
is exactly why we did Consorts of the Caliphs. I'm just alerting you to the fact that there is a kind of a knee-jerk reaction in certain populations, right? That there seems to be. So one does a lot of work trying to expand, and people are more comfortable reading, say, your strip where it says Charlemagne was sent an elephant by Haroon Rashid, because it kind of undergirds an idea that somehow this is a world civilization. And yet when one provides, as you have done, all the other parts of what makes up the civilization, there's a kind of a reticence. So that's what I'm really saying is that you're doing a massive service by producing everything that makes this up. When I teach Baghdad to my students, I say to them, if you think of New York, for example, just as an example, or London, and you think of, say, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or you think of New York University, or you think of, I don't know, the governor's mansion, you kind of also have to think about Greenwich Village and street artists and, alternative lifestyle and the subway and
well, how terrible is it to say we shouldn't read these women's writing because they were slaves? Like, so their voices shouldn't be
no,
heard?
I don't think it's about,
no,
let's not I don't want to mischaracterize. I don't think they were saying, let's not read them. I think they were saying, why are you focusing on slavery when you're talking about the caliphate, right? When you talk about glory.
It was a big part. I mean, it wasn't a perfect city, and I try, I don't paint it as a perfect city. Even in my silly little book of cartoons, the flaws are apparent, but they were humans, and there's not been a perfect human society yet.
No, absolutely, and that's exactly right. There's too much of a romanticized view of these places, and frankly, scholars are guilty of that too, right? Yeah. So that if a scholar were to maintain, for example, that the only thing that matters is, quote, high culture, whatever that means, and all we need to study is philosophy, or all we need to study is, I don't know, elite literature, one gets a completely skewed view. Yet another reason one need not get a PhD in Arabic literature and just buy this book. Yeah. So let's treat the viewers to some of the actual panels. I have a list here. I don't know if you have any ones specifically you want to show, but maybe Ibn al-Hajjaj, episode 14, is a good one to start with in light of what we've just been talking about.
Exactly, because it was a literary interest of the medieval Baghdadis themselves to preserve the language of the street. And the famous example of this is Ibn al-Hajjaj, who in his day job was a market inspector, so in charge of upholding the morals of the marketplace, but wrote the filthiest, most disgusting poetry that you could possibly imagine. And it's really gross. So just fair warning before you go read Sinan and Toon's lovely book on the subject. But they had an interest themselves, and it comes up in the book a lot, in preserving the slang of thieves and the underworld. And that made, my job in portraying the daily life of Baghdad that much easier, didn't it? But the contrast between this kind of double personality, it's the whole jid and the seriousness and jest thing all over again. It's kind of omnipresent.
But it's also as Geert-Jan van Gelder has argued, and as you have argued as well, it's not even so much that this is not a paradox. It's simply it's a pairing, right? It's a pairing. Yeah. So it should not be paradoxical that this man is a market inspector and then writes an ode. You've called it an ode to filth. By the way, I read Sinan Antoon's book, and another really helpful aspect of the way you set this up is, even were someone to read only one or two of these, one can already find a reference here to an academic work that one can turn to in order to explore one's interest. It's not as if one has to read a lot of prose or cull through the bibliography in order to find it. Yeah, and this is also a good illustration, a good example of the lovely, not only the skill in your illustration, but also the colorizing of it, which is really
a lovely job,
splendid. Yeah, it's really been a splendid one. I also like the fact that we're introduced to many roles as well. So, for example, here the market inspector, or the jurist, or any number of people who held positions. Yeah. I think if one were to make a list of positions and fault you for missing a major one, maybe a major one would be the vizier.
Right. The caliph has a guard. Sometimes Popeye's kind of a vizier, sometimes the caliph's guard, but
I'm just saying that to tease you. I mean, there's too many. There's too many things. Yeah, you have the chamberlains, you have the executioners, you have them all. Can we look at episode 21?
Sure. There you go. So this is the caliph's guard, who's another recurring character.
Yeah. This is also a great one, and it's a very famous story, and I'm glad you included the Arabic and so on. And this is this idea throughout the literature that people were either appointed to or offered a specific political office or an office in the civil administration, and people not wanting to accept such a position for any number of reasons. Even Grouch, who appears now and again, famously refused to serve as a judge because he was worried that God would judge him for a false judgment. But this
Yeah.
one is lovely because it ends with this way that he disqualifies himself by just speaking very eloquent gibberish, which is wonderful. What must be is not incumbent, and what is in it must not be, but it may be that it must be what it is.
That's
Which is,
your Jan's translation of
yeah,
real medieval Arabic nonsense.
yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And a lot of your pieces, single frames or strips, are two people in conversation, right?
Mhm.
And so it's an exchange of some kind. And so what's also a strength of the book is the wide variety, or the range of the kinds of conversations that take place. And it's not so in many ways, talk about seriousness and jest is too limiting, right? It's the whole spectrum of the kinds of conversations that took place between friends, between peers, between enemies, between detractors, and so on.
Right. Well, I keep coming back to the sort of anecdote organization of medieval Arabic literature itself, which of course had its roots in an oral tradition. So it's records of people's conversations at the end of the day, or it's either real records of people's conversations or pretending to be records of people's conversations. So
or records of pretended conversations.
Right. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So given that, what is can we look at 96?
Sure.
So I want to know whether 96 is time travel. That is to say, is this you? Is this from the tradition, or is this you distilling something from the tradition and producing a strip that represents it?
Well, yeah. So sometimes the anecdotes are translations, and other times they're sort of translations of translations. So my turning a interesting idea into a funny joke.
Yeah.
And I've been studying magic in my own research recently, so magic has seeped deeply into
That's a sign that we're done, but I'm not going to stop if that's okay with you.
If people want to get bored and want to stop watching, they can just stop the video, can't they?
I don't know how to stop my timer, which is a problem. But so there's another one like this, which is 56.
Okay. Now this is yeah. So this is based more on a theme.
That's 103.
Oh, whoopsie. I see.
Yeah, you're gonna have to go to.
There you go.
Yeah, so this too, right? You say the fact is Alhaj was a prolific writer who is most famous for his multi-volume book about animals, the Kitab al-Hayawan. He had a habit of veering off topic in his delightfully meandering style. You cite James Montgomery's Alhaj in praise of books, a wonderful book. And then this, and so this is you, right? This is not from the tradition.
No, this is me making fun of Alhaj's tendency to go on and on.
It's brilliant. It's an absolutely brilliant take, right? Chapter 9, 204, Pigeons, the Pros and Cons. Popeye, you've written 10 volumes already. Don't you think you've written enough? Fascinating question. I'm going to add a chapter about that. Thanks, Curly.
But now he would write a chapter about
he would.
Enough chapters.
Yeah, absolutely. And so so I actually really like the fact that I think these are the only two that struck me as sort of obviously you, as opposed to.
There are a lot of them, probably as many as our translations. Yeah, maybe it's not always clear which is which.
Yeah.
But.
No, and I'm glad of it, because I think that's in keeping with I mean, speaking for myself as a reader, I'm glad of it because it's part of the way in which you're trying to present this material, which is not simply to say, and which argues against what I asked you earlier, let's take a book and illustrate it somehow and be, more or less faithful. This allows you to do what you want to do with the material, which you've been studying for a long time and reading, and which you've internalized in some ways, that allow you to come up with your very own, right, little strip, which I thought was great. And can we look at, there's a couple that, I mean, I don't want to spoil the reading for the book. It's going to be hard to spoil. There's 120
of them. So I think
we're going to see 10, but one I like a lot, close to my heart, is 42.
Alrighty. 42.
Because it's about Fadl.
Well, this comes from your lovely book, isn't it? I love that anecdote that it comes from as well. And this is very much my reworking of.
Absolutely, because the anecdote is
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's wonderfully done.
So in the original anecdote, Thank you. It really did get me thinking about the role of these women we were talking about, because basically the original anecdote is someone says, I think you must have been training your, I mean, I think she was a slave at that point, to write letters like you because she's almost as good as you are. And he's like, are you kidding? She taught me how to write letters.
I'm pretty sure this is Fadl and Saeed ibn Humayd. In fact, they were lovers.
Oh, were
And,
they?
for a long time, they were an item. And I'm pretty sure it's Ibn Abi Tahir who leans over and says, this is pretty good. And in another version of the anecdote, he says, Saeed says to Ibn Abi Tahir, look, don't tell anyone
Right.
that it's her. Yeah, absolutely. And,
Right.
you know, speaking of women's voices, one of the things about, there's an anecdote, I'm pretty sure it's Arib, in the collection from which you took this one, which actually is told entirely by her. So most of these anecdotes are told on the authority of men, and we learned that, you know, so and so reported it. There are some, and you know, there are many others. That, of course, would also be something worth doing, I think.
Definitely.
Right? Women of medieval Baghdad or something, and it could draw from.
Well, that book itself, which actually I think I have it here to wave at people as well. This book that you've been referencing would make a good. I mean, maybe if I were going to do a new comic strip, you suggested this one, and I'd love that.
Or maybe, or since this is already there, Abu Faraj Isfahani, Abu Faraj al-Isfahani has what's it called? Ima al-Shawa'ir, right? The slave poetesses. There are. Pernilla, who endorses your book, would be a good person to ask, right?
Definitely, yeah.
So
she wouldn't help with the dirty joke issue, would she?
I don't know. She might. So one of my favorite is number 80.
Yeah.
Which is Abu Nuwas. Is it not? Or maybe it's not Abu Nuwas. Why is Coral in a bad mood today? No, that's not the one. Not 80.
It must not have been 80.
No, it's the one with wine and gold.
Alchemy.
I miswrote the number, I think.
There it is.
85. Yeah. So, hey, Popeye, what are you reading about alchemy? But it doesn't make sense. The book suggests there is a substance that if liquefied at left to age will turn into gold. I don't know. It makes sense to me. Yes. No. There's another one as well where, but I've forgotten the number now. But talk to us a little bit about your interest in alchemy and your interest in magic and the occult, because that makes its way into this book. And I think it's fair to say, it's fair of me to say that if you had not been someone interested in alchemy, magic, and the occult, it probably would not have made it into this book, because that truly is marginal, even within the discipline of Abbasid studies. There are very few people who work on it. I don't mean by marginal, I don't mean insignificant. I just mean that few people work on it.
Yeah, that's changing. I mean, a bit now. I think this particular take of, the symbolism of wine was very influenced, I should say, by James Montgomery's Abu Nuwas Justified Sinner, which is such a fantastic article. And this is kind of a translation of his article more than an anecdote. But yeah, I think again, our lack of regard as modern scholars for the magic and talismans and jinn and all that stuff that's actually is all over medieval Arabic literature is more of a symptom of our own, like, we modern people don't care about magic, it's silly or something like that, that has given us a blind spot there. But yeah, so I randomly wandered into this through the avenue of studying the history of medicine. Obviously, those two things are very related. A colleague of mine found a magic manuscript in John Ryland's library in Manchester, Tower Memorial, and one thing led to another. And now I'm studying a book of magic spells attributed to a famous scholar of Arabic language named Zeki. Nowadays, all anyone remembers about him is that he wrote Miftah al-Ulum, the Key to the Sciences, which is a book of language. But if you read the biographical dictionaries about him written closer to his time, he was known as a magician. That's what he was famous for. He was a court magician for the Khwarezmians and the early Mongols. So, like, we've forgotten that. And
to the credit of the academy, as it were, you are funded to study this book.
The Leverhulme Foundation has kindly funded the study of this book, yes. And he did make his way into my book as well. Here, I'm going to show you poor old Zeki. because there's a story about him. Here's a story about him having actually, so he, in this book, he's the kind of the court magician of the Baghdadi Caliph who gets fired and ends up working for the Khwarezmians. But Zeki himself actually tried to help the Shah of Khwarezm attack the Caliph of Baghdad with a magical statue. And the magical statue, whether it was its own decision or he just didn't do it right or what, actually ended up helping the Caliph of Baghdad instead. So there's a bit of a magical misfire, and that has gotten cartoonified.
This is a particularly fun one, and I like this one too, sort of as a strip, also because you have this. Most of them take place in a moment. And this one has a next day, has a kind of an effect. So it's set up slightly differently from the other ones, which is wonderful. In wrapping up, okay. I want to look at two things. You mentioned modern readers. You've mentioned moderns a few times. Yeah. I want to look at 115 and then 120, just to alert the folks out there to a couple of things that you did that I appreciated. One is in this one, in your explanation about Haroon and Charlemagne, you say, it fires the imagination that two such famous rulers from different worlds corresponded. It's like Captain Picard wrote letters to Princess Leia, which of course is not only, I mean, that's wonderful on many levels, but it's also a way to bring in the modern reader, right? It's a way to make something that is, because the sad fact of it is there are going to be people who don't know who Charlemagne is and who don't know who Harun al-Rashid is.
Well, then the people who do know about him almost like they're fictional characters rather than historical people. And it's just exciting that they were real people and they sent one another elephants.
Yeah, exactly.
So, how good is that?
Well, two, right? Two and one died on the way, and this is the one that survived.
I didn't know that. That's sad.
The story, yeah. So that's one, and then
wait. Before we move on, can I just show you the necklace that I wore for this occasion? I bought this necklace. You can't see it very well, but I bought it from this Viking reenactor craftsperson in Latvia online. And it is in fact an inaccurate representation of an Abbasid dirham, because a silver coin, because the Vikings wore silver coins from Baghdad as jewelry.
Yep.
And it's just kind of cool to me that I bought this reproduction Baghdadi coin from a Viking reenactor man on Etsy, and it just shows how those worlds were so interconnected. And I find it fun.
So actually, you're reminding me that maybe Ibn Fadlan is the thing to turn into. It's already been turned into a film, although the film starts out in the 13th Warrior as the Ibn Fadlan account and then morphs into Beowulf. But there are some ripping yarns that could be turned into.
You showed me that in a class at Cornell, incidentally.
Sorry.
Yeah, the 13th Warrior, and that did make it into this book as well. So
that's right, it did. I wore a T-shirt that features a cartoon. I thought that would be amazing.
Okay. Yeah, let's see.
From Mauritius. No Viking coins in Mauritius, to my knowledge.
No.
I thought we would close with number 120, which is the final one in the book.
Okay, sure. There's the Viking, incidentally, Vikings didn't really have helmets with horns at some point, so there you go.
They didn't.
Oh, there's a genuine exchange rate of squirrel skin and the water wheel. Yeah, so the water wheel is a technology that Europe adapted. Okay, but yeah, this is the last one that you wanted to see.
So Princess Leia and Picard, but this one, right? This one is meta, right? Because it's about you writing this. And I was reminded of a Star Trek episode, and I wanted to know whether you'd seen it. And if you hadn't, you need to.
Okay.
In Deep Space Nine.
Mm-hmm. I've seen the whole thing, so I must have seen it.
Right. So Cisco is the commander of the space station. One episode takes place entirely in San Francisco, and all the characters are transposed in the way that they used to when in the first season of Star Trek, in the original Star Trek. That kind of San Francisco scene. But in this one, Cisco plays a black science fiction writer who's writing about a space station called Deep Space Nine, in which there's a black commander.
Oh, I do remember this episode.
They all populate this, and he's trying to sell this story, and everyone says, "Don't be ridiculous. Who's ever going to believe this?" And so it's not just about,
Yes, it's amazing. I
yeah.
love it.
I mean, when I read this, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this is just like that. And it's kind of a instantiation of it, right? In the
Mhm.
opposite direction. Yeah.
Well,
Well, it's a
yeah.
wonderful book. I should ask you
Thank
whether
you.
there's anything that you want to say to the viewers that we haven't broached in our relatively rambling conversation.
Not really. I think we've touched everything. I mean, I just say like if you do pick up the book, you don't have to read them in order. I wouldn't want to suggest that people have to read them. So maybe that's something I wish I had have mentioned in the introduction, that you could just go to random pages, couldn't you? But yeah, I think we've covered most of the important
I
points.
suspect people might do that anyway, especially when they look at the break. I mean, I didn't, but when they look at that is to say, I read them in order when I sat down to read it as a book. But when I first got it in my hands, I looked at the categories and I flipped through. So, the first thing I went to, of course, was literature and poetry. And then Baghdad
Well,
Lady.
see, this is the thing, is my favorite chapters are the party ones and the poetry ones that come at
Right.
the end. And so like the best comes at the end.
Yeah.
But what can you do?
But different people, different folks, different strokes. So
That's true. Yeah.
whatever it is that people say.
Yeah.
And I should mention that the picture of you on the back is absolutely priceless.
Thank you.
So not just the pictures on the front.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't think this was designed by your department to be a sales pitch, but I would happily make a sales pitch for this book. I think it's a wonderful introduction to Baghdad for people who don't know it, but even for people who do, and I count myself as one of those, and so I'm my own measure of this. I found it fascinating to read through. And
thank you. I really appreciate that.
And I hope that you do more of them, and I hope others feel empowered to do more. And you've mentioned a few times the voices that we don't usually hear, notably the voices of women, and I hope that material is what you and others turn to as well. If I could draw to save my life, I would do something, but I can't. I also have no imagination, so I have 2 strikes against me.
I thought I couldn't do it either, and then I did. So you could give it a try.
Maybe I think I'll stick to. I don't know what I'll stick to.
You have your own ways of bringing these things to life, don't you? As I learned as your student. So
perhaps,
you don't really need
perhaps.
From
But thank you. Thanks for this invitation. It was a good. Actually, it forced me in the best way to reread the book closely, as opposed to just enjoy it. And
I really appreciate you chatting with me about it.
No, it was great fun. I look forward to chatting with you about your next book.
Thank you.
If not online, then in person, which would be nice.
That would be even nicer.
You give my best to everyone at Exeter.
I will.
Sajjad, Rob, and others, and Istvan and others.
Yes, my lovely department. Yeah, I will do. I'll stop the recording now.
Sure.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to our future
everyone.
viewers. Bye, everybody.